Clara Whitmore's wedding ring felt like a shackle before the preacher had even finished his prayer. She stood at the altar in a borrowed cream dress, shaking so badly that the lace trembled against her wrists. At 19, she had been forced to marry a mountain cowboy she had never met. The tall man beside her had not looked at her since she entered the church. Not when she spoke her vows. Not when the ring was placed on her finger. And not when a tear slipped down her cheek. The summer of 1878 had nearly killed Harrow Creek. The Wyoming sun had burned the grass yellow, dried the creek to a muddy line, and driven even the dogs beneath the porches. 14 months earlier, Clara's father had fallen dead while plowing a field. He left no savings and no land. He left only a debt of $340 owed to Gerald Holt, the richest landowner in the county. Gerald had come to Clara's small house carrying the signed note. "You have two choices," he had told her. "Work in my home for 7 years, or marry my nephew and clear the debt at once." His nephew was Ethan Blackwood, a lonely cattleman who lived high in the Blackwood Range. "He needs a wife," Gerald had said. "You need a home. There are worse bargains." Clara had stared at her father's signature. The crooked letters looked like the final words of a man who could no longer protect her. "When?" she had asked. 3 weeks. That was how her future had been decided. People in Harrow Creek called Ethan the Wolf of Blackwood Range. He came into town only a few times each year. He bought flour, coffee, ammunition, and salt, then disappeared back into the mountains. He never drank at the saloon. He never played cards. He never joined town gatherings. Some said he had killed men. Others claimed he kept wolves around his cabin. Phyllis Garrett, the woman who had given Clara the wedding dress, told her a different story. "Ethan had a wife once," Phyllis whispered. "She died years ago. Whatever was alive inside that man was buried with her." On the wedding morning, Clara stood before a cracked mirror, while Phyllis pinned the loose dress around her waist. Other young women dreamed of flowers, music, and a man waiting with love in his eyes. Clara had stopped allowing herself such dreams. Dreams belonged to women with money and families. Still, as she walked alone toward the church, one thought refused to leave her. What kind of man agreed to marry a frightened girl without meeting her first? The church was packed. Clara knew most of the people had not come to celebrate. They had come to watch the penniless laundress become the wolfman's bride. Ethan stood near the preacher in a dark coat that pulled tightly across his broad shoulders. He was taller than she expected, with sun-browned skin, dark hair, and a short, rough beard. He looked like a man built by hard winters and heavier work. When Clara reached him, he finally turned. His nearly black eyes rested on her face for one brief moment. There was no hunger in them, and no cruelty. There was something harder to understand, as if he disliked the bargain as much as she did. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Clara counted every one of them. When the preacher announced that Ethan could kiss his bride, Clara tightened her fingers around her wildflowers and prepared herself. Ethan did not touch her. He studied her face, gave one slow nod, and offered his arm. Someone in the back pew laughed. Behind the church, Gerald provided cold chicken, bread, and weak drinks for the wedding meal. Ethan remained apart from Clara, answering questions with as few words as possible. Sandra Pruitt, the dry goods merchant's wife, approached Clara with a pleased little smile. "A roof, food, and a husband," Sandra said. "That is more than a girl in your position should expect." Clara raised her water glass. "Is that so? You must learn to manage him. Keep his house clean, stay out of his way, and never ask questions. If you are sensible, he may treat you well enough." Before Clara could answer, Ethan appeared beside her. "The wagon is ready," he said. His eyes remained on Clara, but the hard line in his jaw suggested he had heard every word. She followed him without saying goodbye. They traveled toward the mountains in silence. With each mile, Harrow Creek grew smaller behind them. The road climbed through dry hills, then vanished beneath dark pines and pale aspen trees. Ethan held the reins loosely, while Clara watched the land rise around her. After nearly an hour, he spoke. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Clara turned toward him. "I'm not." It was not entirely true. Most people are, he said. I'm not most people. For the first time, something almost like amusement touched his face. No, he said. I reckon you're not. The Blackwood Ranch stood inside a wide valley, surrounded by mountains. Clara had imagined a dark cabin and rotting fences. Instead, she found a strong log house, a clean barn, a cared-for garden, and horses grazing beneath the evening sun. A large gray dog approached and sat several feet away. That's Chess, Ethan said. He'll leave you alone unless you want him not to. And if I don't want him to, he'll follow you everywhere. Clara looked at Ethan. His expression had not changed, but she realized he had made a joke. Inside the house, the floor had been swept and the table cleaned. There were no dirty dishes or clothes lying around. Ethan had prepared the place for her. He carried her small bundle down the hallway and stopped beside a door. This is your room, he said. Mine is at the other end. Clara stared at him. There's a bolt on the inside of your door, he continued. You can lock it whenever you want. She had spent 3 weeks fearing what her new husband might demand on their wedding night. Yet he had given her a separate room and a lock only she could open. Ethan placed her bundle on the bed and walked outside without asking for thanks. Clara stepped farther into the room. A blue jug stood upon the wooden chest. Inside it were fresh purple and yellow wildflowers, carefully picked and arranged by hands strong enough to wrestle cattle. Beside the jug rested a small folded paper. Clara opened it. The message contained only 7 words. Nothing in this house will be taken from you. She read it twice, then looked toward the doorway through which her silent husband had disappeared. Perhaps Harrow Creek had been wrong about Ethan Blackwood. But if he was not the monster people feared, Clara needed to discover what had happened on this mountain to make him live like one. Clara woke before sunrise with her hand resting near the bolt on her door. For one confused moment, she did not know where she was. Then she saw the purple and yellow flowers on the wooden chest and remembered the wedding, the mountain road, and the silent cowboy sleeping at the far end of the house. She dressed in her own cotton blouse and worn brown skirt. Nothing borrowed this time. She unbolted the door and stepped into the cold main room. The house was silent. Clara found kindling beside the stove and started a fire. She filled the kettle from the outdoor pump, then prepared coffee, salt pork, and cornbread. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the sun began touching the mountains. He looked at the stove, the food, and then at Clara. You didn't have to do this. I know, she replied. Sit down. He paused, almost surprised by the order, but then obeyed. They ate across from each other without speaking, yet the silence felt different from the one they had shared in the wagon. It no longer felt cold. It felt like 2 people waiting to learn which words were safe. The food is good, Ethan finally said. Thank you. After breakfast, he placed his plate in the basin and reached for his hat. I'll be in the barn most of the morning. The house is yours. Do whatever you want with it. What needs doing outside? He turned. Outside? I did not come here to sit by a window while you work. Tell me what needs doing, or I'll find it myself. His dark eyes studied her. The garden needs water, he said. A mare in the 3rd stall is close to giving birth. The east pasture fence also keeps coming loose. I'll handle the garden and check the mare. You know horses? I know enough. Ethan touched the brim of his hat and left without another question. The mare's name was Bess. She was large, brown, and in no mood to trust a stranger. Clara entered the stall slowly, speaking in a low voice, until Bess allowed her close. Chess sat outside the stall, watching every move. You're a serious creature, Clara told him. His tail struck the ground once. After checking Bess, Clara watered the garden and followed the east fence until she found a rotted post near a large boulder. She could not repair it without tools, but she knew the post had to be replaced. She found Ethan inside the barn repairing a saddle strap. The 3rd post past the boulder is rotten, she said. Tightening the wire won't hold it. He raised his eyes. How do you know? My father wasted 2 summers fixing the wire around a bad post. Some mistakes teach themselves well. Ethan set the strap aside. I'll replace it. I can help if you show me how. His silence lasted several seconds, but Clara was beginning to understand it. Ethan did not stay quiet because he wished to punish people. He stayed quiet because he considered every word before letting it leave him. After the noon meal, he said, for the first time since arriving, Clara walked back toward the house with the faint sense that she might have a place on the ranch. On her third afternoon, she found the grave. She had climbed into the trees above the house while learning the boundaries of the property. In a small clearing stood a wooden marker, carefully shaped and carved by an untrained hand. Ruth Eleanor Blackwood, beloved, 1871. Clara stared at the name. 7 years had passed since Ruth's death. 7 years since Ethan had lost his first wife and shut himself away from Harrow Creek. The grave faced the entire valley. From that spot, Ruth could rest beneath open sky, looking over the house, pasture, and distant mountains. Clara understood that Ethan had chosen the place himself. She left without touching the marker and did not mention finding it. That evening, however, she watched him sit at the table and saw more than the hard mountain cowboy people feared. She saw a man who had once loved someone enough to carve the word beloved with his own hands. 2 weeks passed before trouble rode onto the ranch. A frightened boy raced into the yard, his horse covered in sweat. 3 men stopped my uncle on the lower road, he said. They took his supply money. He sent me to find Mr. Blackwood. Ethan came from the barn, and within minutes, he had saddled Drum. Clara watched him mount. His face held no wild anger. That made him more frightening. Every movement was calm and controlled. Stay here, he ordered. I know. Just come back. His eyes remained on her for a moment before he rode away. Clara tried to work, but she kept returning to the yard. When Ethan finally came back 2 hours later, the stolen money hung from his saddle, and the 3 robbers walked behind him with their wrists tied. You waited, he said. I wanted to see whether you listened when I told you to come back. Something almost broke through his hard expression. I'll take them to the sheriff tomorrow. I'll bring them water and food, Clara said. Tied men still get hungry. Ethan stared at her, as if she were the strangest person he had ever met. Don't look so surprised. As she turned toward the house, Clara heard a short sound behind her. It was not quite laughter, but it was close. She heard his real laugh days later while he taught her to ride properly. A rabbit burst from the grass, frightening the gray mare beneath her. Clara grabbed the saddle horn, lost her balance, and landed in the dust. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. The change in him stole Clara's breath. His eyes became bright. The hard lines around his mouth disappeared, and for one moment, he looked like a younger man who had never buried anyone. If you laugh again, Clara warned from the ground, I'll put salt in your coffee. That only made him laugh harder. He offered his hand. Clara took it, and he pulled her up so quickly that she nearly struck his chest. They stood close, her fingers trapped inside his larger hand. Neither moved. Then Clara stepped away. Again, she said, pointing toward the horse. That night, she opened the small wooden box containing everything she had brought from Harrow Creek. Beneath her father's letters, she found Gerald Holt's marriage agreement. She unfolded it and read the terms carefully. Near the bottom was a clause she had not understood before. During the first year, Ethan had the right to end their marriage and send her back to Harrow Creek. If he did, her father's entire debt would return to her. Clara read the lines again as cold spread through her body. The room, the flowers, the work, and the first signs of trust could all disappear with a single decision from Ethan. Then the floorboard outside her door creaked. Clara looked up. Ethan was standing in the doorway, staring at the agreement, trembling in her hands. Ethan's eyes moved from Clara's face to the marriage agreement in her hands. You found the clause, he said. Clara rose from the bed. You can send me back during the first year. If you do, my father's debt becomes mine again. I know what it says. Then the note you left beside those flowers was not true. Everything here can still be taken from me. Ethan entered the room, but he stopped several feet away. He did not cross the space without her permission. "I didn't write that clause," he said. "Gerald did." "But you signed the agreement." "I told him to remove it. He said it was needed in case the marriage failed." Clara folded the paper carefully because she did not want Ethan to see how badly her fingers were shaking. "Are you planning to use it?" "No." His answer came without hesitation. "You barely know me. I know enough to understand that sending you back would be wrong." Clara searched his face. "What is this marriage to you, Ethan?" He looked toward the wildflowers in the blue jug. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But it is not a debt, and you are not something I can return." Clara waited for doubt to appear in his eyes. It did not. "I believe you," she said. Something loosened in Ethan's shoulders. He pulled the chair from beside the chest and sat quietly, while Clara placed the agreement back inside her box. Neither spoke again, but he remained until the lamp burned low. Days later, Ethan entered the kitchen with a hard look on his face. He drank his coffee standing, which Clara had never seen him do. "What happened?" she asked. "The upper spring is failing." Clara understood what that meant. Without water, the pasture would die. The horses and cattle would have to be moved or sold. The ranch could be ruined before winter. "How bad is it?" "Less than 1/4 of its usual flow. If it keeps dropping, we'll be hauling barrels from the river 4 miles away." "Why is it failing?" Ethan set down his cup. "Aldous Crane owns the northern property. The spring begins near our boundary. 3 years ago, he started diverting part of it toward a new pasture. Then stop him. Crane has money, hired men, and friends inside the county court. Men like him don't steal everything at once. They take a little each year, until fighting them costs more than surrendering." Clara thought for several moments. "Is there another water source?" "There may be a seep in the upper timber. Developing it would take weeks. Then we start digging. You did not agree to spend your summer breaking rock." "I agreed to this ranch," Clara replied, "whatever that requires." Ethan stared at her, as if she had spoken words he had waited years to hear. They needed pipe fittings, so 2 mornings later, they took the wagon into Harrow Creek. Ethan entered the hardware store while Clara purchased thread, salt, and coffee. She stepped onto the wooden walkway and nearly collided with Sandra Pruitt. Sandra looked over Clara's clean dress and straight posture. "Well, you survived longer than people expected. People should find better things to discuss. It cannot be easy living alone with that man. Still, a woman sold into marriage must accept whatever life gives her." Several people nearby turned to listen. Clara stopped. She was ready to answer when heavy boots sounded behind her. Ethan walked past Clara and placed himself between the 2 women. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said quietly. Sandra's smile weakened. "My wife has as much right to this town as you do. If you have something to say about her, say it to her face when there isn't an audience to enjoy it. I was only expressing concern." "No, you were trying to shame her." The street became silent. Ethan offered Clara his arm. She accepted it, and they walked to the wagon beneath the eyes of the entire town. They traveled nearly a mile before Clara spoke. "I could have handled her." "I know." "Then why did you interfere?" "She stopped speaking to you. She began speaking about you for everyone else to hear. That was different." Clara looked at the man beside her. "You hated the way Gerald arranged our marriage." Ethan's hands tightened around the reins. "You were given no real choice," he said. "I knew that was wrong, but Gerald told me you would be worse off if I refused. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps it was what I needed to hear. You could not have known what I needed." "No, but I know more about you now." "What do you know?" He considered the question before answering. "I expected someone who would survive this arrangement. I didn't expect someone who would start fixing everything she touched." The words stayed with Clara as the wagon climbed. "Tell me about Ruth," she said. Ethan became still. 2 bends in the road passed before he answered. "She was kind, kinder than anyone I knew." "How did she die?" "I chose a shorter road home from Laramie. It crossed a high pass. A storm came before we reached the other side." His voice remained controlled, but Clara heard the pain beneath it. After that, I stopped letting people close. And now? I don't know what I'm doing now. That's all right. You say that often, because it keeps being true. The next morning, they began digging in the upper timber. The work took 11 days. They broke hard ground, cleared stones, strengthened the channel, and carried pipe fittings uphill on drums back. Ethan never treated Clara like a helpless girl. He showed her how to read wet ground and connect the pipes, then trusted her to work beside him. On the 9th day, a thin line of clear water entered the channel. Clara dropped to her knees and placed her hand beneath it. The water was cold enough to hurt, but she laughed. It's running. Ethan crouched across from her. It's running. They looked at each other over the small stream. They had saved the ranch together. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Gerald Holt. Ethan read it at the kitchen table, and his face hardened. Clara took the page from him. A new survey claimed that 40 feet of Blackwood land belonged to Aldous Crane. The disputed strip ran directly through their new channel. If Crane wins, Ethan said, he takes our land and the water beneath it. Clara read Gerald's letter again. Its careful words could not hide the truth. Gerald had known about Crane's plan before their wedding, before the flowers, before Clara had trusted Ethan. She looked across the table at her husband. The man who arranged our marriage has just helped Crane steal the ranch. 4 riders entered the Blackwood yard on an early September morning. Clara recognized Aldous Crane first. Gerald Holt rode beside him. The other men carried a leather case and official court papers. Ethan stepped onto the porch before Clara could reach the door. "What is this?" he asked. Crane's official handed him an order signed by a judge in Laramie. Crane had filed a claim against the northern boundary. Until the court reached a decision, Ethan was forbidden from using the water channel. "You chose a judge 4 counties away," Clara said. "Why?" "The Laramie court moves faster," Crane replied. "And costs more," Ethan added. Clara looked directly at Crane. "You diverted our spring, waited until we built another channel, and then claimed the land beneath it. What are you truly after?" "The water," Crane answered before caution could stop him. "That channel feeds from the same source as my lower pasture. I don't intend to share it." The yard became still. Clara turned toward Gerald. "You knew." Gerald lowered his eyes. "You knew about the diversion before sending that letter. You knew Crane planned to take the channel." "I believed everyone would be compensated," Gerald said. Ethan's face became colder than Clara had ever seen it. "You arranged my marriage because a man with a wife and home has more to lose than a man living alone." Gerald did not deny it. "The ranch contains valuable timber," he finally admitted. "Crane and I planned a larger operation across this valley. You gave me something to lose before telling me what it would cost. I raised you, Ethan. And now you are helping another man steal from me. Get off my land." Crane pointed toward the papers. "The order still stands." "We'll follow the order," Clara said. "Then we'll destroy your claim in court." Crane glanced at Ethan. "Your wife has many opinions." "My wife is right." Ethan said it without hesitation. The words struck Clara with more force than any grand speech could have done. After the riders left, Ethan sat on the porch steps with the papers in his hands. "I have to go to Laramie," he said. "I need a lawyer." "Then go. I can't leave you here alone." "You can. I know the animals, the gates, and the water lines. I have worked beside you for 11 weeks. Ethan looked at her. "You're not afraid?" "I'm afraid of losing this ranch. I'm not afraid of protecting it." He left before sunrise 2 days later. Clara watched until Drum carried him beyond the ridge. The house felt wrong without him. She had lived alone before, but during the past 11 weeks, silence had become something they shared. Without his boots on the porch, or his voice inside the barn, that silence felt empty. On the second night, one of the mares developed a fever. Clara moved her into an isolated stall, cooled her with wet cloths, and remained beside her until midnight. The fever finally broke. Clara returned to the kitchen exhausted, but she wrote every detail in the ranch notebook. Ethan would have known what to do faster, but he had not been there. Clara had been enough. On the 4th afternoon, the mailboy arrived with 2 letters. The first came from Oliver Pettifer. A hearing had been scheduled for October 22. Pettifer had also found a Laramie land attorney named Samuel Beaumont, who was willing to examine the case. The second letter came from a rancher named Carl Briggs. 4 years earlier, Crane had claimed part of Briggs's land. Briggs could not afford a legal fight, so he surrendered the property and signed an agreement promising silence. His final words made Clara sit very still. "I settled because I was alone. You have more than I did. Use it." Ethan returned before sunset. Beaumont accepted the case, he told her. He found a fatal mistake in Crane's survey. They measured from the wrong granite outcrop. Then their entire boundary is false. That's what Beaumont said. Ethan handed her drum's reins. He also wants a written record of Crane admitting he wanted the water. I wrote it down the same afternoon, his exact words, the date, and every witness. Ethan stared at her. "You knew we would need it?" "I thought we might." His face softened. Carl Briggs was right. "What do you mean?" "I have more than he did." Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Clara found 6 ranchers who had faced similar claims from Crane. 4 agreed to speak. 2 agreed to write sworn statements. The strongest witness was Henry Good, a sheep rancher who had lost a strip of land 12 years earlier. Henry had saved every letter, map, and record inside an old wooden box. "My son planned to grow an orchard there," Henry said. "After Crane took the land, the boy left for Colorado. I kept these papers because I believed someone would come asking one day." "Will you testify?" Clara asked. "I have been waiting 12 years to do it." On the wagon ride home, Clara could not stop thinking about the orchard that had never been planted. "We are no longer fighting only for our water," she said. "No," Ethan agreed. "We're fighting for everyone Crane chose because they stood alone." Ethan fell quiet before taking her hand. "When Gerald arranged our marriage, I wanted someone who could help keep the ranch alive," he said. "I told myself that was all." "And now? You made this a place I want to come home to. I did not think I could want that again." Clara tightened her fingers around his. "I stayed, Ethan. After the 3rd week, I stopped thinking about leaving." "Why the 3rd week?" "That was when I fell from the horse and heard you laugh. I saw the man hidden behind everything Harrow Creek believed." He held her hand for the rest of the journey. October 22 arrived far too quickly. The Harrow Creek courthouse was packed. Ranchers filled every bench. Gerald sat alone near the back, while Crane remained beside an expensive Laramie attorney. Judge Miriam Hale examined both surveys before calling Oliver Pettifer. He showed the court that Crane's hired surveyor had used the wrong granite outcrop as the starting point. Then Henry Good placed his 12-year-old box on the witness stand and told the court about his son's lost orchard. Finally, Beaumont called Clara. She walked forward with steady hands and repeated Crane's admission exactly as he had spoken it in her yard. During cross-examination, Crane's attorney approached with a calm smile. "Mrs. Blackwood, you were brought to this ranch because of your father's debt. If your husband loses today, you may lose the only home you have. Isn't it possible you changed Mr. Crane's words to protect your own security?" Every face in the courtroom turned toward Clara. Crane watched her with a thin smile. Ethan sat behind her, unable to help. The entire ranch now rested on the answer Clara gave next. Clara looked directly at Crane's attorney. "My security has never come from money or land," she said. "I arrived on that mountain with 1 dress, 2 working hands, and a debt I did not create." The attorney's smile faded. "If you are asking whether I changed Aldous Crane's words, then ask the 4 other people who heard him. He said he wanted our water because he did not intend to share it. I wrote his words down that same afternoon." The courtroom stirred. Clara held the attorney's gaze. "I did not lie when I had nothing. I have no reason to begin now." Judge Miriam Hale made a note. The attorney asked 2 more questions, but the strength had gone from his attack. Clara answered each one calmly before returning to Ethan. His hand found hers beneath the table. "You were perfect," he whispered. "I was honest. That is what I meant." The judge called a 2-hour recess. Ethan and Clara waited in Phyllis Garrett's boarding house with Beaumont, Pettifer, and several ranchers. No one could speak about the case for long. Every conversation returned to the weather, winter feed, or cattle prices before dying away. Ethan finally went outside. Clara found him alone in the back garden. "If we lose," he said, "Crane will control the water before winter. Then we appeal. It could take years. Henry Good carried that box for 12. We can carry this longer than one afternoon." Ethan looked at her as if he were still learning the full measure of the woman Gerald had forced him to marry. "You never stop, do you? I counted 11 minutes at an altar because I refused to run. Stopping has never been my strongest talent." He raised one hand and touched her cheek. "That day in the paddock, when you fell from the horse, was the first time I had laughed since Ruth died." Clara placed her hand over his. "You were always allowed to laugh." Before Ethan could answer, Beaumont appeared at the door. "The judge is ready." Judge Hale's ruling took 14 minutes. Crane's new survey had failed to use the landmark recorded in the original county deed. It could not replace Pettifer's records. The disputed strip belonged to Ethan Blackwood. The water channel was legally part of Blackwood Ranch. The judge also found enough evidence of unlawful water diversion for Ethan to bring a second case against Crane. The gavel struck. Clara turned toward Ethan. "We won." He stood and pulled her to her feet. "We won." Across the room, Henry Good rested one hand on his wooden box. For the first time in 12 years, he no longer needed to guard it alone. Outside the courthouse, Crane's attorney quietly offered a large settlement to prevent another trial over the stolen water. "What should we do?" Ethan asked Clara. "Take it." He looked surprised. "Use part of the money to repair the barn," she continued. "Give another part to Henry Good. We don't owe him money. He risked Crane's anger and broke his silence for us. Perhaps his son will return if there is enough land left to plant an orchard." Ethan studied her face, then nodded. "All right. You agree?" "I have been agreeing with you since you told me my fence post was rotten." Gerald Holt waited near the courthouse door with his hat held against his chest. "I was wrong," he said, "about Crane, the ranch, and the marriage." "You treated people like pieces in a business deal," Ethan replied. "I know." Ethan remained silent for a long moment. "Come to supper on Sunday. We have things to discuss." Gerald looked up in surprise. "This does not mean everything is forgiven," Ethan warned. "It means I'm willing to hear the truth." On Sunday, Gerald told them that a logging company wanted the northern timber. He had kept the offer secret while planning his agreement with Crane. Ethan refused to sell. "My father believed land should be passed forward, not stripped bare for quick money." Gerald left the names of the company's owners and promised never to hide another offer. It was not enough to repair everything, but it was a beginning. After supper, Ethan remained at the kitchen table while Clara washed the dishes. "There is something I need to ask," he said. Clara turned. "Ask." "If you had met me without the debt, without Gerald, and without that church full of people watching, would you have chosen me?" She did not answer quickly. The question deserved more than kindness. She remembered the hard man at the altar who would not kiss a frightened girl. She remembered the bolt on her bedroom door, the wildflowers in the blue jug, the laughter in the paddock, the water channel, and his hand holding hers in court. "Yes," she said. "It might have taken time, but I would have chosen you." Ethan stood. "I'm not an easy man." "No. You think too long, speak too little, and try to carry every burden alone." His mouth almost lifted. "And you argue with dangerous men on the porch. I never said I was easy either." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her. There was no bargain in it, no debt, no preacher, and no watching town. Clara kissed him because she chose to, and Ethan held her like a man who had finally stopped fearing everything he could lose. When they parted, his forehead rested against hers. "I love you," he said. "I love you too." This time, his full smile appeared. It changed his entire face, just as it had the first time she saw him laugh. Winter buried the ranch beneath 2 feet of snow. Clara and Ethan worked through it together. The money from Crane's settlement was placed in an account carrying both their names. Ethan had arranged that before the judge gave her ruling. "Why both names?" Clara asked. "Because whatever came from the fight belonged to both of us." They sent part of the settlement to Henry Good. By spring, Henry rode up the mountain with his son, Thomas, who had returned from Colorado. Ethan showed him a protected southern slope where the soil was deep and the morning sun stayed warm. Thomas stood there for a long time. "My father says an orchard could grow here." "So do I," Ethan replied. They began planning it that afternoon. Gerald returned with his wife, Margaret. She brought purple and yellow wildflower seedlings for Clara's garden, the same kind Ethan had placed in the blue jug on their wedding day. That evening, after everyone left, Ethan took an old poetry book from a chest. It had belonged to Ruth. He opened to a poem about morning light returning after a long darkness and read it aloud. His voice was rough and quiet, but it never broke. Clara sat across from him while Chess slept between their chairs. When Ethan finished, he closed the book. "I couldn't read that after she died," he said. "I can now." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "Read me another." Outside, young horses moved inside the barn. Water flowed through the channel they had built together. Farther down the mountain, a father and son were preparing the ground for an orchard. Clara had entered this house as payment for a dead man's debt. Yet the wedding gift that changed her life had never been the flowers alone. It was the lock Ethan placed on her side of the door. He had given her the freedom to choose, and when she finally did, she chose him.